Hey there. Tonight, we're going back to explore the bizarre laws of ancient Greece, a world that was far more peculiar than its marble ruins suggest. As you get comfortable and begin to unwind, we'll drift through the streets of Athens and the barracks of Sparta, uncovering all the strange rules that governed every aspect of life. If you enjoy these calm historical journeys, I'd love it if you'd leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from, and perhaps consider subscribing for more. We'll soon see how a civilization celebrated for logic was also bound by superstition, fear, and some truly bizarre regulations. So just settle in, close your eyes, and imagine you are walking through the sun-drenched agora, where the air is thick with the scent of olives, dust, and the weight of 1,000 unwritten rules. You find yourself in a world that feels both familiar and deeply, profoundly alien. This is the heart of ancient Greece, a concept that lives in our minds as a place of pristine white temples, of philosophers in clean robes debating the nature of the soul, and of the birth of democracy in a sunlit assembly. And all of that is true in its own way. But it is a polished truth, a highlight reel curated by 2 millennia of admiration. The reality, as is so often the case, was messier. It was dustier. It smelled more intensely of unwashed bodies, of charcoal fires, of fish being gutted in the market, and of the metallic tang of fear that underpins any society built on strict, and sometimes strange, foundations. The laws of this world were not carved into stone just to be admired. They were living, breathing things, a complex and often contradictory web of rules designed to hold a fragile society together. They were born from reason, yes, but also from deep-seated superstition, from a desperate need for social control, and from a worldview that saw the individual as a small, functioning part of a much larger, more important organism: the city, state, the polis. And each polis was its own little universe, with its own character, its own gods, and its own peculiar set of anxieties. A law that was sacred in stern, militaristic Sparta might be laughed at in cosmopolitan, commercial Corinth. A rule of life in democratic Athens might seem tyrannical to a farmer in a rural Boeotian village. To understand the strange laws of Greece, you have to understand that there was no Greece in the way we think of a country today. There was, instead, a constellation of rival cities, a family of bickering cousins who shared a language and a pantheon of gods, but who would rarely agree on how to properly run a home. Tonight, we are going to drift through this constellation of rules. We will not be looking at the grand treaties between nations or the constitutional frameworks of democracy, but at the smaller, more intimate laws. The rules that governed what you could wear, who you could talk to, how you were allowed to grieve, and even whether or not you were permitted to be lazy. These are the laws that get under the skin of a society, that reveal its deepest fears and its most cherished values. Think of your own world. The written laws are one thing, but the unwritten rules of social conduct, the things you just know you shouldn't do at a dinner party or in a quiet library, those are what truly shape our daily interactions. In ancient Greece, many of those unwritten rules were, in fact, written down, enforced with the full power of the state. They were grappling with new ideas, with the volatile chemistry of putting thousands of people together in one place, of creating a citizenry. They were, in essence, making it all up as they went along, and some of their solutions were, from our modern vantage point, deeply strange. We will begin in Athens, the city of wisdom, under the guidance of a man named Solon. A poet and a statesman, he was tasked, around the early 6th century BCE, with saving the city from tearing itself apart. The rich were growing richer, the poor were falling into debt slavery, and the social fabric was fraying like an old rope. Solon's solution was a raft of new laws, a radical restructuring of Athenian society. And many of his laws were aimed not at the powerful, but at the personal. He understood that to control a society, you must first control its appetites, its vanities, and its passions. And so he turned his legislative gaze upon one of the most fundamental forms of human expression: what people chose to put on their bodies. This is where we first encounter the sumptuary laws, a term that sounds grand but boils down to a simple, intrusive idea. The state has the right to tell you how to dress. Imagine an Athenian woman, let's call her Myrene, preparing for a religious festival. In her wooden chest, she has a fine linen chiton, dyed with a costly purple pigment imported from Tyre. It shimmers. It speaks of wealth, of status, of a husband who is successful. She also has a set of gold earrings, crafted in the intricate shape of cicadas, a symbol of Athenian earthborn pride. But as she reaches for them, she hesitates. Solon's laws are new, and the air is thick with a nervous energy. The laws stipulate that women may only wear a certain number of garments, that the value of their adornments cannot exceed a certain limit. The goal was to curb the ostentatious displays of wealth that fueled jealousy and social strife. It was a form of enforced modesty, a legal gray tunic thrown over the vibrant colors of class difference. So Myrene puts the purple chiton back. She leaves the golden cicadas in their box. She chooses a simpler, undyed garment and a single, modest cloak. She is still wealthy, and everyone knows it. But the law demands a performance of simplicity. It's a quiet, daily humiliation for the rich, and a quiet, daily comfort for the poor. It doesn't solve the underlying inequality, of course, not really. It's like putting a filter on a photograph. The reality is unchanged, but the presentation is softer, more palatable, less likely to cause a riot. These laws weren't just about class envy. They were also about a deep-seated suspicion of luxury itself, a belief that it softened men, made women vain, and weakened the moral fiber of the city. To the Greek mind, particularly in the earlier, more austere centuries, excess was a sickness. It was hubris, a dangerous pride that invited the wrath of the gods. A woman dripping with gold was not just showing off. She was testing fate. She was daring the universe to notice her, and the gods, as the myths constantly reminded them, did not take kindly to mortals who shone too brightly. So the sumptuary laws were a form of spiritual insurance as much as social engineering. By dressing simply, the city as a whole was practicing a kind of collective humility, hoping to fly under the radar of divine jealousy. It's a strange thought that your choice of dress could endanger the entire community, that a pair of earrings could be seen as an act of reckless endangerment. But in a world where earthquakes, plagues, and military defeats were seen as direct consequences of divine displeasure, it made a certain kind of sense. Every aspect of life was connected, and the smallest personal choice could have cosmic implications. A simple cloak wasn't just clothing, it was a prayer for stability. The legal gaze of Solon did not stop at the wardrobe. It followed the citizen from the cradle to the grave, and it lingered, with particular intensity, at the moment of death. Funerals in pre-Solonian Athens had become extravagant, theatrical displays of grief and status. Noble families would hire professional mourners, women who would shriek and wail, tear at their clothes, and scratch their own faces until they bled. It was a performance of sorrow, a competition to see who could grieve the loudest, the most visibly, the most impressively. The processions would snake through the city, deliberately disruptive, a noisy, chaotic assertion of the family's importance, even in death. To Solon, this was not just unseemly, it was dangerous. It was another crack in the city's foundation, another way for the wealthy to assert their dominance and for public space to be consumed by private passion. So he legislated grief itself. His laws laid out strict rules for mourning. The funeral procession had to be silent and must take place before sunrise to minimize public disruption. Only the closest female relatives were allowed to participate in the mourning rituals at the home, and even they were forbidden from the most extreme displays of grief. No more scratching of cheeks, no more tearing of clothes, no more rehearsed dirges listing the accomplishments of the deceased, and absolutely no more hired wailers. Grief was to be a private, dignified, and quiet affair. Imagine now that same woman, Myrene. A year has passed, and her father has died. She stands beside his body, laid out in the courtyard of her home. The air is cool, the pre-dawn sky just beginning to turn from inky black to a bruised purple. The scent of funerary herbs is thick and cloying. Her heart is a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She wants to scream. She wants to keen and cry out the stories of her father's life, his kindness, his strength. She wants to feel the catharsis of a shared, public lament, but she cannot. The law hangs in the quiet air between the mourners. Her grief must be contained, folded inward like a piece of linen. She can weep, softly. She can place a lock of her hair with her father. But the great, shuddering release of a full-throated wail is denied to her. It is a stolen thing, taken by the state in the name of public order. From our perspective, it seems monstrously cruel. To regulate sorrow, to tell people the correct way to feel the worst pain of their lives, feels like the ultimate overreach. But for Solon and the Athenians, it was a necessary surgery. The wild, untamed passion of grief, like the wild, untamed passion for luxury, was a threat to the rational, ordered city they were trying to build. The needs of the polis superseded the needs of the individual's aching heart. The city's stability was paramount, even if it meant a daughter had to swallow her tears and mourn in silence. These two sets of laws, about clothing and about funerals, reveal the same core principle of the Greek legal mind. The private life is a public matter. What you do in the privacy of your home, how you dress, how you mourn, how you spend your money, it all ripples outward, affecting the community. There was no clear line, as we might draw today, between personal freedom and public responsibility. Your life was not entirely your own. It belonged, in a very real sense, to the city. And the city, in return for your participation and your obedience, offered you an identity, a purpose, and a place in the cosmos. It was a bargain, and like many bargains, its terms could feel, at times, incredibly strange. It was a world where a piece of jewelry could be an act of rebellion, and a tear shed too loudly could be a crime against the state. This deep-seated belief that the private sphere was a matter of public concern extended most powerfully to the lives of one half of the population, women. In democratic Athens, a city that celebrated the freedom and political agency of its male citizens, the lives of respectable women were circumscribed by a cage of laws and customs, so restrictive it can be hard for us to fully comprehend. The ideal Athenian woman of the citizen class was expected to be invisible and silent in the public sphere. Her world was the oikos, the household, and her domain was everything within its walls. The law, and the even more powerful force of social expectation, dictated that she should rarely leave it. Imagine you are an Athenian wife, a woman named Theano. Your day begins with the first light filtering into the courtyard that sits at the center of your home. This courtyard is your window to the world. You hear the sounds of the city waking up, the distant rumble of carts heading to the agora, the cry of a vendor selling figs, the laughter of men on their way to the assembly or the gymnasium. But these are just sounds, muffled by the stone walls of your home. Your world is one of touch and smell. The rough texture of the wool you are spinning into thread, a task that will occupy hours of your day, every day. The smell of olive oil, used for cooking, for lighting, for cleaning your skin. The scent of baking bread from the kitchen, where your slaves are preparing the day's meals. You oversee all of it. You manage the household stores, you direct the slaves, you care for the children, you weave the cloth for your family's clothes. You are the chief executive officer of a small, vital corporation, the family. But you are a CEO who is not allowed to leave the office. The law is not explicit. There isn't a statute that says, a woman shall not leave her home. It is more subtle, more insidious than that. It is a collection of smaller rules and overwhelming social pressures. You cannot go to the market. That is a man's world, a place of business and gossip considered unsuitable for a respectable woman. Sending a trusted slave is the proper way. You cannot visit your friends without a good reason and your husband's permission. You certainly cannot be seen out at night, unless it is for one of the rare, women-only religious festivals, and even then, you must be escorted. To be a woman walking alone in the streets, especially after dusk, was to invite suspicion. It implied you were of low status, a prostitute, or that you were up to no good, perhaps on your way to meet a lover. Your reputation, and by extension, your husband's honor, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a single, unsupervised walk. The only socially sanctioned reasons for a respectable woman to be seen in public were for funerals and for certain religious festivals. These festivals, like the Thesmophoria, were a vital release valve. For a few days, the rules were suspended. Women would leave their homes, gather together, perform secret rites in honor of the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, and exist in a world free from male supervision. One can only imagine the intensity of these moments, the rush of temporary freedom, the joy of shared community for women who spent most of their lives in domestic isolation. It highlights the starkness of their everyday reality. The law and custom had effectively divided the city in two: the chaotic, public, male world of the streets, the assembly and the marketplace, and the ordered, private, female world of the home. The threshold of the front door was a powerful, legally reinforced boundary between two separate realities. This control over women's movement was intrinsically linked to the laws surrounding marriage and inheritance, which were designed with one primary goal in mind: the orderly transfer of property from one generation of men to the next. Women were the conduits through which this transfer happened, but they were rarely its beneficiaries. In Athens, a woman could not inherit property in her own right. She was not a legal entity in the same way a man was. If a father died with sons, the property was divided among them. But if he died with only a daughter, a strange and difficult legal situation arose. This daughter was known as an epikleros. The word is often translated as heiress, but this is deeply misleading. An epikleros did not inherit the estate. She was the estate. Or rather, she came attached to it, a package deal of woman and wealth that the law dictated must be passed to the nearest available male relative. Let us imagine our young woman, Chloe, whose story we touched on earlier. Her father, a moderately wealthy potter, has just died. She is his only child. She is now an epikleros. By law, she is now required to marry her father's closest male relative, perhaps a paternal uncle she barely knows, or a cousin who is much older or younger than her. It does not matter if she likes him. It does not matter if she is already in love with someone else. It does not matter if he is already married. In some cases, he would be expected to divorce his current wife to marry the epikleros and claim the estate. The purpose of this law, known as the epiklerate, was to keep the property within the father's family line. The woman was the vessel, the legal fiction that allowed the land and money to stay in the bloodline. Any son she had with her new husband would not be considered the son of that husband, but the heir of her deceased father, and he would inherit the estate upon coming of age. It is a system of mind-bending complexity, all designed to solve a simple patriarchal problem: what to do with the money when there are no boys. From our perspective, it is a law of profound cruelty. It reduces a woman to a chess piece in a game of dynastic inheritance. It denies her any agency in choosing the person with whom she will spend her life and have children. For the Athenians, however, it was a cornerstone of social stability. It prevented the fragmentation of family wealth. It ensured that ancestral lands stayed within the clan. It was a rational, if ruthless, solution to a logistical problem. The emotional toll on the woman at the center of it was simply not a factor in the legal equation. And so, Chloe must marry her uncle. She will move from her father's house to his, her life's path irrevocably altered by a law that sees her not as a person, but as a component of an inheritance. Her duty is to the preservation of her father's estate and lineage. Her own happiness is an irrelevant luxury. These laws, governing both the physical location of a woman's body and its legal status in marriage, paint a stark picture. The freedom celebrated in the Athenian assembly was a freedom for men only. For the other half of the population, life was a state of perpetual legal minority, their existence dictated by the needs of their male relatives and the overwhelming priority of keeping property in the right hands. The strangeness of these laws lies in this profound contradiction. A society so obsessed with the idea of liberty for some could be so comfortable with the complete subjugation of others. The walls of the Athenian home were not just made of mud brick and stone. They were reinforced with the full weight of the law. The state's obsession with regulating behavior didn't stop with the control of women or the policing of grief. It extended into the very character of its male citizens. In many Greek cities, and particularly in Athens, there was a deep-seated anxiety about idleness. A man without a trade, without a purpose, without a visible means of supporting himself, was not just seen as lazy, He was seen as a potential threat to the social order. This anxiety was codified into law. There was a specific charge one could bring against another citizen, a graphi argias, a public indictment for idleness. Imagine a man named Damon. He's not poor, having inherited a small farm that is worked by a couple of slaves, providing him with a modest but steady income. He enjoys his leisure. He likes to spend his mornings in the agora, not to conduct business, but simply to watch the world go by. He listens to the chatter of the merchants, the arguments of the philosophers, the pronouncements of the heralds. He is, in his own way, taking the pulse of the city. But to his neighbors, his idleness is suspicious. He produces nothing with his own hands. He doesn't practice a craft. He doesn't engage in commerce. He just exists. And in a society that valued utility and contribution, this was unsettling. His neighbor, a blacksmith whose days are filled with the clang of the hammer and the heat of the forge, might view Damon's leisure not with envy, but with contempt. This contempt could curdle into a legal challenge. The blacksmith could formally accuse Damon of argia. Damon would then be forced to stand before a court of his fellow citizens and justify his way of life. He would have to prove that he had a legitimate source of income and was not a drain on the city. The law stipulated that every citizen must teach his son a trade. To fail to do so was a dereliction of paternal duty. The underlying philosophy was simple. An idle man has too much time to think. He might get involved in political conspiracies. He might fall into debt and become a tool for would-be tyrants. He might simply become a burden, relying on friends or the state for support. A busy citizen, a man focused on his craft or his farm, was a stable and predictable citizen. He was too tired at the end of the day for sedition. This law against laziness feels almost comical to us, living in an age that often glorifies leisure as the ultimate prize. But for the Greeks, it was a serious matter. It was about ensuring the polis was composed of productive, self-sufficient, and therefore reliable parts. It wasn't about a moral judgment on laziness as a sin, so much as a practical judgment on it as a social liability. It's like a community garden where every member is expected to tend their plot. The person who lets their patch grow over with weeds isn't just failing themselves. They're threatening the health of the entire garden, as their weeds might spread to other plots. Damon, enjoying his quiet morning, is, in the eyes of the law, a patch of weeds. The fact that he could be legally prosecuted for his lifestyle is a stark reminder of how little the Greeks valued privacy and individual choice when they clashed with the perceived needs of the community. Your time, like your money and your grief, was not entirely your own. It was a resource that you were expected to invest wisely for the good of the city. This microscopic regulation of public behavior extended to other, seemingly trivial, areas of life. While Athens was a bustling, often chaotic city, there were still unwritten, and sometimes written, rules about public decorum. For example, while not a formal law in the same way as the graphi argias, public displays of affection were generally frowned upon. A husband and wife kissing in the agora would have been a shocking, unseemly sight. The public sphere was for the serious business of men. Romance and affection belonged in the private sphere of the home. This wasn't about prudishness in a sexual sense. The Greeks were, in many ways, very frank about human sexuality, but about a sense of propriety and place. There was a time and a location for everything, and the marketplace was not the place for intimacy. It was a violation of the unspoken social grammar. In some cities, this was taken even further. The philosopher Plato, in his design for an ideal city in his work, The Laws, proposes strict regulations on all forms of public behavior, creating a society of almost monastic self-control. While Plato's ideas were theoretical, they reflect a real impulse within Greek culture towards order and the suppression of individual passions in public space. Perhaps the most extreme example of the state controlling the personal appetites of its citizens comes not from Athens, but from its great rival, Sparta. If Athens regulated lifestyle through a series of specific, targeted laws, Sparta did it by redesigning human life from the ground up. Spartan law was a total system, an all-encompassing ideology of discipline, austerity, and communalism. and this system reached right down to what a citizen was allowed to eat. Every male Spartan citizen, from the age of 20 until he was too old to fight, was required by law to eat his main meal every single day, not with his family, but in a communal dining hall with his military unit. This was the syssitia, or common mess. A man's home was just a place to sleep. His real family was the 15 or so men he ate and fought with. Refusal to participate, or failure to contribute your monthly share of barley, wine, cheese, and figs from your estate, was not an option. It would result in a loss of your citizenship rights, a form of social death. Imagine a young Spartan man returning from a long day of brutal military training. He is tired and hungry. He does not go home to his wife and children. He cannot. Instead, he walks to a simple, unadorned hall where the men of his unit are gathering. The meal is famously Spartan. The centerpiece is the legendary black broth, a soup made from pig's blood, pork, salt, and vinegar. The accounts from non-Spartans who tried it are universally ones of disgust. One visitor from Italy was said to have remarked that he now understood why Spartans were so willing to die in battle. The food was intentionally bland, minimalist, designed to provide sustenance without pleasure. Luxury was poison. Pleasure softened the warrior spirit. This forced communal dining was a powerful tool of social engineering. It stripped away individuality. It eliminated class distinctions at the dinner table, as rich and poor ate the same meager fare. It fostered an intense, unbreakable bond between the men of the unit, a bond that was essential on the battlefield. It ensured the state could monitor its citizens every single day, their conversations, their attitudes, their fitness. A Spartan man was never truly alone, never truly a private individual. His life, from his food to his friendships, was lived in public, under the watchful eye of his peers and the state. This wasn't just a law, it was the central pillar of their entire civilization. It shows how far a Greek city-state was willing to go, how deeply it was prepared to intrude into the most basic aspects of human life, in its relentless pursuit of a specific civic ideal. In Athens, the law might tell you not to be lazy. In Sparta, the law told you where, when, and what you would eat, every single day, for your entire adult life. The Spartan obsession with control and uniformity was not limited to the dining hall. It was etched onto the very bodies of its citizens. Their appearance was not a matter of personal choice, but a statement of their place in the rigid social hierarchy, and it was regulated by law and unwavering custom. For a Spartan man, his hair was a powerful symbol. As boys and youths, undergoing the brutal state-sponsored training program known as the agoge, their heads were kept shaved. A shaved head signified youth, submission, and a state of incompletion. But upon reaching adulthood and becoming a full-fledged warrior, a Spartan man was required to grow his hair long. Long hair was the marker of a free man and a soldier. It was a sign of his status and his readiness for battle. The historian Herodotus tells a famous story of a Persian scout who, before the Battle of Thermopylae, spied on the Spartan camp. He was shocked to see the Spartan warriors not sharpening their swords or preparing their shields, but calmly and meticulously combing and dressing their long hair. He reported back to the Persian king, Xerxes, that the Spartans seemed to be engaging in frivolous vanity. A Greek informant had to explain the reality. This was not vanity. This was a ritual. This was the calm, deliberate preparation of a man who knows he is about to face death. They were tending to their hair as a symbol of their freedom, a freedom they were about to die to defend. The grooming was a psychological act, a moment of focus and defiance. For a Spartan, his long hair was his pride, the uniform he wore even when unarmored. And just as the presence of long hair was a mark of honor, its absence was a mark of profound shame. The punishment for a coward, a man who fled in battle, was not execution. It was something they considered far worse: public humiliation. A coward, known as a ostracism or trembler, was forced to shave off half of his beard and wear a cloak with colored patches. He had to give way to everyone in the street. No one would exercise with him. No one would share a fire with him, and his daughters would be unable to find husbands. He was a walking ghost, a social leper. The enforced shaving was the most visible part of this punishment, a constant public reminder of his disgrace. He was stripped of the symbol of his manhood and his status as a warrior. Every time he saw his reflection, he would be confronted with his failure. It was a psychological punishment of immense cruelty, designed to be a deterrent more powerful than death itself. In a society built entirely on honor and reputation, the loss of that honor was the ultimate penalty. The state, through this simple act of controlling a man's appearance, could effectively erase him from society without ever laying a hand on him. This meticulous control over the Spartan citizen began in infancy and was formalized in the agoge, the state educational system that every Spartan boy was forced to enter at the age of 7. The agoge was not a school in our sense of the word. It was a 13-year ordeal designed to systematically break down a boy's individuality and rebuild him as a cog in the Spartan military machine. The training was savage. The boys were kept perpetually underfed, clothed in a single thin tunic year-round, and forced to sleep on beds of reeds they had to cut themselves from the riverbank. The goal was to produce toughness, to create men who were impervious to hardship, pain, and hunger. And it is here that we find one of the most famously strange of all Greek laws, or rather, state-sanctioned customs, the institutionalized encouragement of theft. The boys in the agoge were deliberately given insufficient rations. They were expected to be hungry, always. The state encouraged them to supplement their meager diet by stealing food from the farms and kitchens of the city. This was not seen as a moral failing. It was a critical part of their training. It taught them stealth, cunning, and resourcefulness skills that would be vital on a campaign, when a soldier might have to live off the land. It was a practical education in the arts of survival and espionage. However, there was a crucial catch. The crime was not in the act of stealing. The crime was in getting caught. A boy who was caught stealing was punished severely. He would be whipped, sometimes viciously. The whipping was not for the theft itself, but for his incompetence, for his clumsiness, for his failure to be a good thief. It is a piece of logic so alien, so perfectly Spartan, that it's almost beautiful in its brutal simplicity. It teaches a lesson that is the absolute inverse of what most societies try to instill in their children. It says, the act is fine, so long as you are successful. Failure is the only sin. Imagine you are one of these boys. You are 9 years old. Your stomach is a hollow, aching knot. You have not felt truly full in years. At night, you and a few of your packmates creep out of your barracks. The moon is hidden by clouds. The air is cold on your bare arms and legs. Your target is a nearby farm, where you know a cheese is being stored. The world becomes a symphony of terrifying sounds. The crunch of your bare feet on the gravel, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the olive grove. Your heart hammers against your ribs. This is not a game. If the farmer catches you, he will beat you. If you make it back with the cheese, you will eat, and you will have earned the respect of your peers. If you are caught by one of the older youths who supervise the agoge, the price will be the lash. The fear is real, but so is the hunger. This system was designed to weed out the weak, the hesitant, and the unlucky. It was a constant, low-level war game played out in the fields and storehouses of Sparta itself. It created men who were daring, opportunistic, and utterly devoid of the conventional morality that governed other Greek cities. An Athenian would see a thief and think, criminal. A Spartan would see a successful thief and think, future leader. It is a law that perfectly encapsulates the Spartan worldview. The ends always justify the means. The survival and dominance of the state is the only true good, and any action that serves that end is, by definition, a virtuous one. This relentless focus on the state's welfare over individual morality permeated every aspect of Spartan life, creating a society that felt, to other Greeks, like a strange and intimidating cult. The communal dining, the hair regulations, the training in theft, they were all threads in the same coarse fabric of a society that had deliberately sacrificed everything we might associate with a normal human life family. Comfort, privacy, pleasure on the altar of military readiness. The laws of Sparta were not just a set of rules. They were a complete operating system for human beings, designed to produce a single, perfect product, the unstoppable hoplite warrior. The law requiring men to eat in the syssitia, the communal messes, was perhaps the most socially transformative of them all. Let's drift back to that dining hall. It is more than just a place to eat the infamous black broth. It is the center of a Spartan man's social and political life. Here, in the company of the same small group of men every night, a Spartan's reputation was forged. His contributions to the conversation were noted. His jokes were judged. His courage was constantly, subtly tested through ritualized taunting and banter. New members were voted in by the existing members of the mess. The vote was conducted in secret, using pieces of bread. Each member would drop a piece of bread into a bowl. A normal piece of bread was a yes vote. A piece that had been squeezed flat in the fist was a no. A single no vote was enough to deny a man entry. The pressure on a young man to be accepted into a mess was immense. To be rejected was to be cast out, to fail at the most fundamental level of Spartan society. Once a member, he was expected to contribute a precise amount of food and wine from his kleros, his allotment of public land worked by helots. If his land failed to produce, or if for some reason he could not make his contribution, he would be demoted from the status of full citizen. This system ensured that wealth could not buy luxury, only the ability to remain a member of the elite. A rich Spartan and a poor Spartan ate the same food from the same pot, but the rich man had a greater security of tenure in his citizenship. The law also had a profound effect on family life. A Spartan man often did not live with his wife until he was 30, even if he was married earlier. He would continue to live in the barracks with his fellow soldiers, sneaking out at night to visit his wife in secret. This was by design. The state did not want a man's primary loyalty to be to his wife and children. His loyalty was to his messmates, the men who would stand beside him in the phalanx. The family was secondary, a biological necessity for producing future soldiers, but not the emotional core of a man's life. The state had deliberately and successfully supplanted the family as the primary unit of social bonding. It's a chillingly effective piece of social engineering, a law that rewired the most fundamental human instincts for the benefit of the state. The stark, brutal logic of Sparta provides a fascinating contrast to the legal world of Athens. If Spartan law was a sledgehammer, Athenian law was a scalpel, a tool for fine-tuning a much more complex and volatile society. And nowhere was this scalpel more precisely applied than in the laws concerning sexual conduct, particularly adultery. In Athens, the law on adultery was simple, direct, and lethal. If a man discovered another man having sexual relations with his wife, his unmarried daughter, his sister, or his mother inside his own home, the law gave him the right to kill the offender on the spot. This was not considered murder. It was considered a justifiable homicide. The act was seen as a profound violation, not of love or emotional fidelity, but of the integrity of the oikos, the household. The adulterer had trespassed, not just into a man's bed, but into the sanctity of his lineage. An adulterous affair could throw the legitimacy of his heirs into question, potentially diverting his property and his name to the child of another man. In a society obsessed with inheritance and bloodline, this was the ultimate crime. The law was not concerned with the wife's feelings, or even the husband's jealousy in a romantic sense. It was concerned with property, honor, and the purity of the citizen bloodline. The man who committed adultery was seen as a thief, stealing the most valuable property a man possessed, the legitimacy of his children. The killing was not an act of passionate rage, but the legal execution of a right. It was the ultimate enforcement of the boundary between the public world and the private sanctum of the home. Imagine the scene. A man, returning home unexpectedly, a sound from the women's quarters, the gynoecium, a part of the house forbidden to any man but the husband, the discovery. The law, in that moment, empowers him completely. He becomes judge, jury, and executioner. The state steps back and allows this private, violent act of justice to take place. Now, it's likely that this extreme right was not exercised as often as the law allowed. There were other options. The wronged husband could choose to exact a large sum of money from the adulterer instead, or he could subject him to a variety of public humiliations. One of the most infamous, though debated by historians as to how common it really was raphanidosis, where the adulterer would be publicly shamed by having a radish thrust into his anus. his pubic hair plucked out, and his body smeared with hot ash. The goal of such punishments was total humiliation, to destroy the man's social standing as thoroughly as killing him would destroy his life. The wife, in this scenario, was often seen as a victim, a creature of weak will who had been seduced. Her punishment was different. She could be divorced by her husband, which was a social and economic catastrophe in itself. But more than that, she was forbidden by law from ever again participating in public religious festivals or wearing any form of adornment. If she tried to attend a festival, any citizen had the right to rip her clothes from her body and beat her, short of causing serious injury. She was, in effect, excommunicated from the civic life of the city, made into a non-person in the religious community. Her crime had made her ritually impure, a stain on the city's relationship with its gods. These laws reveal the deep anxieties Athenians had about female sexuality and the stability of the family. A woman's body was not her own. It was the repository of her husband's honor and the future of his lineage. Its violation was a matter of the utmost public concern, met with laws of terrifying severity. In stark contrast to the violent and shaming punishments for adultery, the Greek attitude towards prostitution was, for the most part, remarkably pragmatic. In most city-states, and especially in major commercial hubs like Athens and Corinth, prostitution was legal, regulated, and even taxed. It was seen not as a moral failing, but as a social necessity, a release valve from male sexual desire that protected respectable women from unwanted attention. The Greeks drew sharp lines between different categories of women. There was the wife, gyne, whose purpose was to bear legitimate children and manage the home. And then there were other women for pleasure. A famous quote, attributed to the orator Demosthenes, sums it up. "We have courtesans, heterae, for pleasure, concubines for the daily care of the body, and wives for the procreation of legitimate children, and to be a faithful guardian of our household." Prostitution was a recognized and stratified part of this landscape. At the bottom were the pornae, common prostitutes who worked in brothels, often as slaves. These brothels were sometimes even state-owned. The great Athenian lawgiver Solon, in the 6th century BCE, was credited with establishing public brothels, using the revenue they generated to help fund the city. His reasoning was practical. By providing a cheap and accessible outlet for young men, it would reduce the likelihood of them seducing or assaulting the wives and daughters of citizens. It was a matter of public order, not public morality. The brothels were legal, but the women who worked in them had no rights. They were property, their bodies a commodity to be bought and sold. They were often located in the rougher parts of the city, like the port district of Piraeus, and their existence was an open secret that society had decided to tolerate for its own convenience. Above the pornae in the hierarchy were the heterae. These were a different class of woman entirely. A hetaira was more of a courtesan, a companion. They were often educated, skilled in music, dance, and conversation. They were independent women, sometimes former slaves who had bought their freedom, or foreigners who were not bound by the restrictions placed on Athenian citizen women. A hetera could attend a symposium, a male drinking party, where she would be expected not just to provide sexual companionship, but to engage in witty and intelligent conversation with the men. The most famous heterae, like Aspasia, the partner of the great statesman Pericles, could become influential figures, known for their intellect and charm. They occupied a strange, paradoxical space in Greek society. They were more free than respectable wives, able to move in the world of men, to own property, and to cultivate their own minds. But this freedom came at the cost of respectability. They could never be wives of citizens, and their children would never be legitimate heirs. The state's regulation of this world was primarily financial. Prostitutes were taxed. Brothel keepers paid licensing fees. It was a reliable source of revenue for the city. This legal framework, this acceptance and taxation of a profession that many other societies have driven underground, is another of the strange contradictions of the ancient Greek world. They could be intensely controlling about the sexuality of their wives, willing to sanction murder to protect the purity of their bloodline, while simultaneously being utterly pragmatic and businesslike about the commercialization of sex just a few streets away. It was a world of carefully constructed compartments, where different rules applied to different people in different spaces. The law was not a universal blanket of morality. It was a complex toolkit for managing the messy realities of a bustling, vibrant, and deeply human city. The hand of the state was perhaps at its most heavy, and its punishments at their most final, when it came to the realm of religion. In the modern West, we tend to think of religion as a matter of private belief and personal conscience. For the ancient Greeks, this concept would have been utterly alien. Religion was not about faith, it was about action. It was a set of public, collective rituals that a city performed to maintain a good working relationship with the powerful, unpredictable, and often dangerous gods upon whom their survival depended. The city's welfare, its harvests, its health, its success in war was believed to be directly tied to the correct performance of these rituals. Therefore, an act of disrespect towards the gods, or a questioning of their existence, was not a personal spiritual crisis. It was a direct threat to the safety and security of the entire polis. It was an act of treason. The legal term for this crime was asabeia, or impiety. The definition of asabeia was dangerously vague. It could mean anything from damaging a statue of a god to revealing the secrets of a mystery cult like the Eleusinian Mysteries, to introducing new, unauthorized deities, to simply arguing that the gods did not exist or did not care about human affairs. The vagueness of the charge made it a powerful political weapon. An opponent could be accused of impiety to discredit him and remove him from the public stage. The most famous victim of an asabeia charge is, of course, the philosopher Socrates. In 399 BCE, he was put on trial in Athens. The official charges were corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city, but in other new spiritual things. Let's try to strip away the layers of philosophical martyrdom and see the trial from the perspective of an average Athenian citizen on the jury. For decades, Socrates had been a familiar, and often irritating, figure in the city. He wandered the agora, engaging people in conversations that invariably left them feeling confused, foolish, and annoyed. He questioned everything. He challenged traditional virtues. He claimed to be guided by a daimonion, a divine inner voice, which to a suspicious citizen could sound a lot like one of those new spiritual things mentioned in the indictment. His accusers argued that his constant questioning was eroding the moral fabric of the city, that by teaching young men like the controversial figures Alcibiades and Critias to doubt everything, he was weakening the state. They were tapping into a real anxiety. Athens had just suffered a humiliating defeat in the Peloponnesian War and endured the brutal rule of the 30 tyrants. The city felt fragile, its confidence shattered. In times of crisis, societies often look for scapegoats, for a simple explanation for their troubles. The argument that Athens had angered the gods, and that Socrates was a symptom of that divine displeasure, was a compelling one. When the jury of 501 citizens voted, a narrow majority found him guilty. He was sentenced to death by drinking a cup of hemlock. His execution was not the act of a superstitious mob. It was a legal proceeding, carried out according to Athenian law. It stands as the ultimate, chilling example of the limits of freedom of thought in a city that, in other respects, celebrated intellectual inquiry. Socrates' crime was not atheism. His crime was thinking the wrong thoughts, out loud, at the wrong time. He had failed to respect the fundamental social contract, that the stability of the city's relationship with the divine was not a subject for debate. The power of the divine in the legal and political life of Greece was not confined to the negative threat of impiety charges. It also had a proactive, directive force, most famously embodied in the institution of the Oracle of Delphi. Nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi was the spiritual center of the Greek world. Here, a priestess known as the Pythia would enter a trance state and channel the words of the god Apollo himself, delivering cryptic prophecies to individuals, generals, and entire city-states. We tend to think of this as harmless superstition, a bit of ancient mysticism. But for the Greeks, the pronouncements of the Delphic oracle were taken with the utmost seriousness. Ignoring the oracle or misinterpreting its advice could have catastrophic consequences. Before any major undertaking, founding a new colony, declaring a war, passing a new set of laws, a city would send a formal delegation on the long, arduous journey to Delphi. Imagine the weight of responsibility on these ambassadors. They would arrive at the sacred site, a stunning and intimidating place, designed to inspire awe. They would perform the required sacrifices, pay the hefty fees, and then wait for their turn to approach the inner sanctum. Inside, the Pythia, an ordinary woman chosen for the role, sat on a tripod, allegedly over a fissure in the earth from which intoxicating vapors arose. She would begin to rave, to speak in riddles and strange verses. The priests of the temple would write down her words and interpret them for the supplicants. The prophecies were famously ambiguous. When King Croesus of Lydia, a phenomenally wealthy non-Greek king, asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle told him, "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great empire." He crossed the river, attacked, and was utterly defeated. The great empire he destroyed was his own. The oracle was never wrong. The failure was always in the human interpretation. While there was no formal law that required a city to consult Delphi, the social and political pressure to do so was immense. To launch a war without the gods' blessing was seen as an act of supreme arrogance, of hubris. If the war then went badly, the general or politician who made that decision would be held responsible, not just for a military blunder, but for a religious one. His failure to consult the oracle would be seen as the root cause of the disaster. The oracle's pronouncements could also be used to settle legal disputes or to sanction new laws. The Spartans, for example, claimed that their entire constitution, the Great Retra, had been given to their legendary lawgiver Lycurgus by the Delphic oracle. This gave their laws a divine stamp of approval, making them almost impossible to question or change. The laws were not just the will of men, they were the will of Apollo. The oracle functioned as a kind of supreme court for the entire Greek world, a widely respected, neutral arbiter whose decisions were backed by the terrifying power of divine authority. It was a way of outsourcing the most difficult decisions, of laundering human political choices through a divine process to make them more palatable and less open to challenge. The strange, rambling words of a woman in a trance became, in effect, the highest law of the land, a force that could start wars, create constitutions, and shape the destiny of millions. It's a powerful reminder that for the Greeks, the world of the gods was not a separate mythological realm. It was an active, intrusive, and legally significant force in their daily lives. Beyond the realms of morality and religion, Greek law also developed sophisticated, and sometimes strange, ways of dealing with the very practical matter of wealth and public finance. In democratic Athens, where the state provided numerous public services and was frequently at war, the need for funding was constant. Direct taxation on income, as we know it, did not exist. Instead, the Athenians developed a clever system known as the liturgical system, which was, in essence, a highly formalized and compulsory form of civic sponsorship for the super-rich. If you were one of the wealthiest men in Athens, the state could legally require you to personally fund a major public expense for a year. This was not a choice. It was a duty that came with your wealth. These duties were called liturgies. One of the most common and most expensive was the trierarchy. A wealthy citizen would be assigned a trireme, one of the city's state-of-the-art warships. He would be responsible for maintaining the ship, paying for its crew, and ensuring it was battle-ready for an entire year. This was a staggering expense, equivalent to millions of dollars today. Another major liturgy was the choregia, the sponsorship of a chorus for the dramatic festivals held in honor of the god Dionysus. A choregos would have to pay for the training, costumes, and living expenses of the chorus that performed with the tragic and comic plays. Let's imagine a wealthy merchant, let's call him Philemon. He has had a good year. His ships have returned from the Black Sea laden with grain, and his profits are high. The city knows this. His name is on the list of the wealthiest citizens. One day, a magistrate informs him that he has been assigned a liturgy for the coming year. He is to be the choregos for a new tragedy by the playwright Euripides. Philemon is not necessarily happy about this. It will cost him a fortune, but refusal is not an option. It would lead to public disgrace and legal penalties, so he accepts his duty. Now, however, another impulse kicks in: competition. While the liturgy is compulsory, there is immense honor and prestige to be gained by doing it well. The dramatic festivals were fiercely competitive. The playwrights would win prizes, but so would their sponsors, the choragoi. If Philemon's chorus is the best dressed, the best trained, and the most moving, and the play wins first prize, he will receive a bronze tripod as a trophy, which he can display in a public place. His name will be on everyone's lips. He will have converted his private wealth into public glory. This system was a brilliant piece of social and financial engineering. It funded the navy and the arts without a government bureaucracy. It transformed the burden of taxation into a public competition for honor. It allowed the wealthy to display their status in a way that directly benefited the city, channeling their private ambition into public good. It wasn't a perfect system. Wealthy men would sometimes try to dodge their duties or even sue another citizen, claiming he was richer and should have to perform the liturgy instead. But on the whole, it was a remarkably effective way of making the rich pay their share, fueled not by the threat of prison, but by the intoxicating allure of public acclaim. It was a law that understood the power of ego as a tool of statecraft. The intricate legal web of inheritance, which we saw in the case of the epikleros, was the cornerstone of family law, but it was preceded by an even more fundamental, and to us, more shocking, social practice: the exposure of infants. While not strictly a law in the sense of a written statute, the right of a father to decide whether a newborn child would be raised or abandoned was a socially accepted and legally unchallenged custom throughout the Greek world. In the moments after birth, the newborn infant would be washed and presented to the father. He would then examine the child. If he judged it to be weak, sickly, or deformed, or if it was a girl and the family felt it could not afford to raise another daughter and provide her with a dowry, he had the absolute right to refuse to accept it into the family. This act of rejection was a death sentence. The baby would then be taken, usually by a slave, to a designated place on a nearby hillside or at a city crossroads and left to die of exposure to the elements or to be eaten by wild animals. This practice, which feels monstrous to our modern sensibilities, was a grimly practical response to the harsh realities of life in the ancient world. Infant mortality was already incredibly high. There was no social safety net, no public support for families with disabled children. A child who could not grow up to be a productive farmer or a soldier, or a daughter who would require a dowry the family did not have, could be seen as a threat to the survival of the entire household. It was a brutal calculus of resources and survival. The decision was not necessarily seen as an act of cruelty, but as a regrettable necessity. The Greeks did not view a newborn infant as a full person in the way we do. It was only after a ceremony held a few days after birth, the amphidromia, where the father formally acknowledged the child and it was given a name, that it was considered a true member of the family and the community. Before that moment, its existence was provisional. Let's try to imagine the quiet, cold reality of it. A midwife places a newborn girl into her father's arms. He is a poor farmer with 3 sons and 2 daughters already. The harvest has been bad. He looks at the tiny, helpless child. He feels the weight of his responsibility to the children he already has, the ones who are already a part of his family. He makes a silent, agonizing calculation. He hands the baby back to the midwife without a word. The decision is made. There is no public outcry. There are no legal repercussions. It is simply his right as the head of the household. This custom is perhaps the starkest illustration of the gulf between the ancient Greek worldview and our own. It highlights a society where the survival of the collective, in this case, the family unit, took absolute precedence over the life of the individual, especially the most vulnerable. While the philosophers debated the nature of the soul, the grim reality on the ground was that a life's value was often measured by its perceived utility. The exposure of infants, like the laws governing women and property, reveals a world where sentimentality was a luxury few could afford, and the law, or the lack of it, reflected that unforgiving truth. The civic life of an Athenian man was not just a matter of rights and privileges. It was a demanding roster of duties and obligations. The city required its citizens to participate, and it had laws to enforce that participation. Failure to engage in the democratic process was not just frowned upon, it could be punished. For example, on days when the public assembly, the ecclesia, was meeting, if there weren't enough citizens present to form a quorum, a special squad of public slaves would be dispatched into the agora. They would carry a long rope soaked in wet red paint. They would stretch this rope across the marketplace and advance, herding the loitering citizens up the hill to the pnyx, where the assembly met. Anyone who was slow to move and got marked with the red paint on their clothes would be fined. It's a wonderfully strange and almost comical image, the state literally roping its citizens into performing their democratic duty. It's like a gentle but firm form of civic cattle, herding. This illustrates a key aspect of Athenian democracy. It was a participatory democracy in the most literal sense. It wasn't enough to simply vote for a representative every few years. The citizen was expected to show up, to listen to the debates, to serve on massive juries, and to be willing to hold public office himself. Many public offices were filled not by election, but by lottery. This was seen as the most democratic method, as it prevented the wealthy and well-spoken from dominating every position. It also meant that any citizen, a farmer, a potter, a blacksmith, might find himself chosen to serve as a magistrate for a year. It was a system that demanded a high level of engagement from everyone. This constant demand for participation leads us to one of the most peculiar legal innovations of the ancient world: ostracism. This was a unique Athenian procedure that allowed the citizens to vote to exile one of their fellow citizens for a period of 10 years. The exiled person was not accused of any crime. There was no trial, no defense, no evidence presented. The process was, in essence, a reverse election. Once a year, the assembly would decide if they wanted to hold an ostracism. If they voted yes, a special day was set. The citizens would gather, and each man who wished to vote would scratch the name of the person he wanted to see exiled onto a broken piece of pottery, called an ostracon. These shards were then collected and counted. If a minimum of 0 votes were cast, the man whose name appeared most often was declared ostracized. He was given 10 days to settle his affairs, and then he had to leave Attica for a decade. His property was not confiscated, and his family could remain. If he survived the 10 years, he could return and resume his life as a citizen. The purpose of ostracism was to diffuse political tension. It was a safety valve for the democracy. If a politician was becoming too powerful, too popular, if it was feared he might try to make himself a tyrant, the people could remove him from the scene before he committed any actual crime. It was a preemptive strike against ambition. Imagine the scene in the agora on the day of an ostracism. The quiet scratching of names onto pottery, the feeling of collective power. You could be voting to exile the most famous general in the city, or the most eloquent statesman. It was a tool to cut down the tall poppies, to ensure no single individual could rise too far above the rest of the citizenry. But it was also a deeply personal and brutal political weapon. A politician could rally his supporters to ostracize his rival. It was a popularity contest in reverse, and the loser was banished from his home. Great figures of Athenian history, like Themistocles, the hero of the Persian Wars, and Aristides the Just, were all victims of ostracism. It is a strange law because it punishes not wrongdoing, but the mere potential for wrongdoing. It is a legal instrument powered by suspicion, jealousy, and fear. It shows a democracy so protective of itself that it was willing to sacrifice one of its own citizens without trial for the perceived good of the community. The punishments for those who did break actual laws in ancient Greece could be equally strange, often focusing as much on public humiliation as on physical pain or financial penalty. The justice system was a very public affair. Trials were held in the open, and punishments were often carried out in the marketplace, the busiest part of the city. The goal was not just to punish the offender, but to make an example of them, to reinforce social norms through a spectacle of shame. For slaves, the punishments were invariably harsher and more brutal than for citizens. A slave who was caught stealing, for example, might not just be beaten, but branded. A hot iron would be used to burn a mark onto their forehead. a permanent, visible declaration of their crime. This brand was an inescapable stigma. It made resale of the slave difficult and marked them for life as untrustworthy. It was a legal scarring, a way of writing the slave's crime onto their very skin. For citizens, while the physical punishments were less severe, the focus on humiliation was just as intense. A man found guilty of certain offenses could be sentenced to stand in the agora for a period of time, perhaps in the stocks, where he would be subjected to the ridicule and contempt of his fellow citizens. Sometimes, they would be forced to carry or wear an object that symbolized their crime. A man who shirked his military duty might be forced to appear in public dressed as a woman, a profound humiliation in the hyper-masculine world of the Greek city-state. These punishments of public shaming, or atimia, dishonor, were powerful because reputation was everything in the small, face-to-face world of the polis. To lose your honor was to lose your social standing, your credibility, your place in the community. It was a form of social death that could be more painful than physical punishment. This use of humiliation was not just about retribution, it was about re-establishing order. A crime was a disruption of the social harmony. The public shaming of the criminal was a ritual that reaffirmed the community's values and visually cast the offender out, at least temporarily. It was a way for the community to collectively say, "This is not who we are. This is not what we do." Imagine a man forced to stand in the middle of the bustling marketplace, locked in the stocks. The merchants hawking their wares ignore him with theatrical contempt. Children point and laugh. Old friends walk by, studiously avoiding eye contact. The sun beats down. He is simultaneously the center of attention and completely invisible, an object of scorn rather than a member of the community. The punishment is not just the physical discomfort. It is the crushing weight of 1,000 silent judgments. These laws and punishments reveal a society that was deeply concerned with appearances, with honor, and with the public performance of civic virtue. Justice was not a cold, abstract process conducted behind closed doors. It was a living, breathing, and often cruel piece of public theater. As we drift towards the end of our journey through this landscape of strange rules, a complex picture of ancient Greece emerges. It is a picture that is far removed from the serene, rational world we often imagine. We see a civilization that, at the very same time it was inventing political philosophy and formal logic, was also legally mandating what hairstyles men could wear. A society that championed democratic participation while keeping half its population in domestic seclusion. A culture that produced the sublime tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, and also required the wealthy to pay for them as a form of compulsory taxation. It was a world of profound and fascinating contradictions. The laws we have explored the sumptuary laws, the regulations on grief, the control of women, the prosecution of idleness, the compulsory communal life of Sparta, the legal right to kill an adulterer, the vague and dangerous charge of impiety, the bizarre political safety valve of ostracism. They are not just a collection of historical oddities. They are the fingerprints of a society grappling with the fundamental questions of human coexistence. How do you forge a collective identity? How do you maintain order in a world that feels precarious and threatened? How do you balance the needs of the individual against the needs of the group? The Greek answer, again and again, was that the group, the polis, must come first. The individual was expected to subordinate their personal desires, their wealth, their passions, even their family loyalties, to the greater good of the city. The laws were the tools they used to enforce this subordination. They were often intrusive, controlling, and, from our perspective, deeply unjust. They codified a rigid social hierarchy, enforced strict gender roles, and showed little concern for what we would call individual rights or personal freedom. But they were also, in their own way, a testament to the seriousness with which the Greeks approached the project of civilization. They believed that a good society did not happen by accident. It had to be built, maintained, and fiercely protected. Every law, no matter how strange, was a brick in that construction, an attempt to impose order on the chaos of human nature. So, as the light fades over the agora, and the last of the citizens, herded by the red rope, have cast their votes, we are left with a more human, more complicated, and perhaps more melancholic vision of this ancient world. It was not inhabited by marble statues, but by people. People who loved and feared and grieved. People who were vain and lazy and ambitious. People who were trying to make their way in a world governed by a set of rules we can barely comprehend. A woman like Myrene, choosing a simple cloak to avoid the law's notice. A daughter like Chloe, forced into a marriage to preserve her father's estate. A boy in the Agoge, his stomach aching with a hunger that is part of his state-sponsored education. A statesman like Themistocles, who saved the city, scratching his own name into a shard of pottery as he is voted into exile. Their lives were shaped by these strange laws, their choices constrained, their emotions regulated. Thinking about their world can give us a sense of perspective on our own rules and customs. The things we take for granted as normal and natural might seem just as bizarre to someone looking back at us from 2,000 years in the future. The foundational paradox of ancient Greece is that it was simultaneously the birthplace of so many of our most cherished ideals of democracy, of freedom of thought, of rational inquiry, and also a place of rigid social control, deep-seated superstition, and often brutal legal realities. It reminds us that progress is never a straight line. It is a messy, complicated, and often contradictory process. The civilization that gave us the Parthenon also gave us the practice of infant exposure. The minds that conceived of Plato's Republic also conceived of ostracism. It is in holding these two conflicting truths together that we can begin to understand the real and deeply strange world of the ancient Greeks. And so, let these stories of strange laws and regulated lives fade into the background. Let the details of the Syssitia and the Epikleros and the Graphiargias soften and blur. The journey is over. The dust of the ancient world settles. There is nothing left to do now but rest and to drift into a quiet, untroubled sleep.